The village in the fog, a place time forgot, but something still lurks. Creepypasta Horror Story. I thought it was just another abandoned village, a place swallowed by time, left to decay in silence. But the moment I stepped into the fog, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. The buildings stood like forgotten tombstones, their shattered windows watching. And the silence. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Then I heard the first knock. Software measured, almost polite. And when I turned around, I wasn't alone anymore. What happened in that village still haunts me. Something followed me home. And if you listen closely, you might just hear it too. Subscribe to MR.Quentin for more chilling stories like this, because some places should never be explored. It all started in late 2021, when a friend casually suggested I watch HBO's Chernobyl miniseries. I didn't think much of it at first, just another historical drama to pass the time. But from the very first episode, something inside me shifted. I was captivated, no, consumed. It was as if I had been plunged into a world so terrifying, so tragic, and yet so utterly fascinating that I couldn't look away. What began as mild curiosity quickly became an obsession. I spent weeks inhaling every book, article, and documentary I could find about the disaster. I studied the sequence of events leading up to the explosion, the horrifying aftermath, the failures, the heroes, the cover-ups. But it wasn't just the science or the politics that gripped me. It was the people. The firefighters who ran toward the burning reactor, oblivious to the invisible death surrounding them. The families forced to abandon their homes, leaving behind lives that would never be reclaimed. The liquidators, sent in to clean up the uncleanable, many of whom never made it out alive. And then there was Pripyat, the city frozen in time. A place where laughter once filled playgrounds, where couples once danced in apartment kitchens, where life had continued, unaware that its days were numbered. A world that, in an instant, had gone silent. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The images haunted my dreams. The stories followed me through the day. The more I learned, the more I felt an unshakable pull toward the exclusion zone. It wasn't just morbid curiosity. It felt like something calling me, something I couldn't ignore. That's when I did it. I found a website offering guided tours of the zone. The moment I booked my trip, a strange sense of relief washed over me, as if I had finally answered a question I didn't know I'd been asking. I was going to Chernobyl. A few weeks later, I stepped off a plane in Kiev, my heart hammering with anticipation. The city was alive with people, cars, flashing lights, so different from the silent world I was about to enter. But I barely noticed. My mind was already far ahead, wandering through the ghost town of Pripyat, standing in the shadow of Reactor 4. I joined a small tour group the next morning. Just a handful of strangers, all drawn to the same eerie curiosity. Some were history buffs, others were thrill seekers, a few simply whispered about wanting to see it with their own eyes. Whatever our reasons, we were all heading to the same place, a world left behind. The bus ride was long, the road stretching endlessly into the distance. Outside, the landscape grew colder, emptier. The sky was a thick sheet of gray, pressing down on the earth like an unspoken weight. Mist curled through the trees, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. Crumbling buildings, skeletal remains of homes, twisted trees, all flashed by in fragments, disappearing before I could fully register them. Our guide, a stern-faced man named Oleg, spoke as we drove. He explained the dangers of the zone, the radiation hotspots, the unstable structures, the importance of following his every instruction. He told us where we were heading next, Yaniv. I had read about Yaniv before. Once a small but thriving railway village just a few kilometers from the reactor, it had been abandoned along with everything else in 1986. The train station, once bustling with passengers, had been left to rust. The homes, the school, the little shops, empty, decaying, silent. Oleg's voice faded into the background. My mind was already there, wandering through the fog. The bus slowed. The brakes let out a low, tired hiss. "This is it," Oleg said, his voice quieter now. The doors creaked open. A gust of freezing air rushed in, sharp and biting. I stepped out onto the cold earth, my boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The others followed, their breath curling into the icy air. And then, for the first time, I felt it. The silence. Not the silence of an early morning or an empty street. This was thicker, heavier, an unnatural kind of stillness, a silence that had lingered here for decades, untouched by time. I looked around. The village of Yaniv stretched before us, half buried in mist. Broken railway tracks disappeared into the white void. Trees, long untrimmed, had twisted themselves around the abandoned station, reclaiming it as their own. The remains of houses stood like forgotten skeletons, their windows dark and hollow. Something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the emptiness. It was the feeling, like we weren't alone. I pulled my coat tighter around me, shoving my hands into my pockets. The others whispered among themselves, their voices barely more than breaths against the silence. Even Oleg, who had surely been here countless times, seemed different now, quieter, more cautious. "There's an old train station up ahead," he finally said. "We can take a look inside, but stay close." We started walking. The ground was uneven, littered with debris, broken glass, rusted metal, remnants of a world left to decay. My boots crunched softly against the dirt, each step echoing through the emptiness. I glanced at the buildings around us, their facades stripped by time and weather. Some doors still stood open, as if waiting for their owners to return. A faded sign above one doorway caught my eye, barely legible, but enough to make out the words, "Produkti," grocery. A store, once filled with everyday life. Now, just another corpse in a dead town. We reached the train station. The tracks were barely visible beneath the overgrowth, swallowed by nature's slow, steady reclaiming. A rusted train car sat motionless on the rails, its windows shattered, its insides dark. I peered inside. A row of empty seats stretched into the shadows, coated in dust. The air smelled of rust and damp decay. And then, a sound. Faint. Almost too soft to notice. A shuffle. A whisper of movement. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. The others were outside, their footsteps crunching in the distance. But inside the train, I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The hairs on my arms stood on end. My pulse quickened. I stepped back, slowly, carefully, until I was out of the train, back on solid ground. I turned to Oleg. "Are there animals here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. I followed, but the feeling didn't leave me. As we made our way back toward the bus, I couldn't shake the sensation, the overwhelming, undeniable sense that something was still watching. Yaniv was a skeleton of what had once been a home, a place where people had laughed, worked, lived, now reduced to nothing more than shattered glass, collapsing roofs, and an unsettling, suffocating silence. Not just silence, the kind you find in an abandoned place, but something thicker, heavier, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Fog curled through the empty streets, moving like something alive. It slithered between the skeletal remains of houses, swallowing what little light managed to break through the overcast sky. I gripped the strap of my bag, my fingers pressing against the worn fabric. The steady, rhythmic click of my Geiger counter was the only sound in the emptiness, a constant, invisible reminder of the danger lingering in the air. Somewhere behind me, the group murmured quietly among themselves, their voices barely above whispers. Oleg stood a few feet away, speaking in a low tone to one of the other tourists. He didn't have to tell us to be careful. We all felt it. I took a step forward, drawn toward one of the houses that stood half buried in mist. It was small, its wooden door barely hanging on its rusted hinges. The paint had long since peeled away, exposing the splintered, rotting wood beneath. The windows were broken, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frame, like teeth in a dead man's mouth. Something about it unsettled me. I should have turned back, should have stayed with the group. Instead, I stepped closer. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy, as if the darkness beyond the threshold was waiting. I lifted my flashlight, hesitated for a moment, then took another step. And then, a voice behind me, low, hoarse. "You don't want to go in there." I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. A man stood just a few feet away. His face was pale, gaunt, his skin stretched too tightly over sharp cheekbones. His clothes were ragged, stained with dirt and something darker. His boots, old, cracked leather, were covered in dried mud. But it was his eyes that froze me in place, wide, unblinking, fixed on mine with an intensity that sent an icy shiver down my spine. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him who he was, but the words stuck in my throat. I glanced toward the others. They were still gathered near the bus, oblivious to the man standing just a few feet away from me. When I turned back, he was gone. The space where he had stood was empty. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. I scanned the mist-covered streets, the skeletal houses, the rusted train tracks that vanished into the white void beyond. Nothing. Just silence. Just the fog. I swallowed hard and turned back toward the group, forcing my legs to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had he been real? A leftover soul of this abandoned world, wandering through the ruins? A squatter, perhaps, one of the few who refused to leave, even after all these years? Or had it been something else? As I reached the others, Oleg glanced at me. His sharp eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You all right?" he asked. I hesitated. Then, after a beat too long, I nodded. "Yeah," I lied. Oleg studied me for a moment longer before turning away. The group began to move again, but I lingered, stealing one last glance at the fog-covered street behind me. For a second, I could have sworn I saw a shadow standing at the edge of the mist, watching. Then, it was gone, and I wasn't sure if I had ever seen it at all. The man's skin was too pale, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, his eyes sunken into dark hollows. His clothes, worn and tattered, hung loosely from his thin frame, as if something had been draining the life from him, slowly, deliberately. There was something wrong about him, a deep, unsettling wrongness that I couldn't quite put into words. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The fog curled around us, thick and heavy, muting the world beyond a few feet. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for some rational explanation. Maybe he was a squatter, one of the few who still hid within the ruins of the zone. Maybe he was a scavenger, searching for scraps of metal or lost relics to sell. I forced myself to speak, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm with a tour group," I said. "We have a guide." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then his expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "What group?" he asked sharply. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder. The others had been just behind me. I had only taken a few steps toward the house, barely even left the group. But now the mist had thickened. The skeletal remains of buildings loomed in the gray void, their jagged edges barely visible. The bus, the guide, the group, gone. A sharp, icy panic twisted in my chest. I turned back to the man, my pulse hammering. "Where did they—" He stepped closer, cutting me off with a low, urgent whisper. "There are rules here," he said. "If you want to leave, you have to follow them." The air seemed to grow colder, pressing against my skin like something tangible, something watching. His eyes flickered toward the shadows behind me before snapping back. "Listen to me," he said, his voice deadly serious. "The rules. 1. Don't stay out after dark." A chill ran down my spine. "Why?" I asked, but he shook his head. "There's no why, just don't." 2. Don't let them see you've noticed them." I frowned. "Them?" He didn't answer. 3. Never follow the lights. The fog swirled between us, and for the first time, I noticed how unnatural it was, how it moved almost with intent, curling through the ruins like a living thing. 4. Never enter a house with a red door. I blinked. A red door? The rule felt oddly specific, almost ridiculous compared to the others. His face tightened. "It's not just the color," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "It's what's behind it." A gust of cold wind rushed past us, making the broken windows around us shudder. No one who's entered a red door has ever come back. I exhaled sharply, glancing around again. The buildings loomed, half swallowed by the mist, their empty windows like watching eyes. The man's words settled into me like a weight. No one has ever come back. "Who are you?" I asked finally. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted past me again, toward something I couldn't see. His posture stiffened, his breathing shallower. "You need to go," he said suddenly. "Now." Something in his tone made my skin prickle. I turned, my heart pounding, half expecting to see something moving in the fog. But there was nothing, just ruins and emptiness. And yet, something in the air had changed. The silence had deepened, thickened. The man took a step back, his hands trembled at his sides. "Run," he said. I hesitated for only a second. Then I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. The mist made everything look the same. Broken walls, skeletal trees, abandoned streets that stretched endlessly into nothing. My breath came in quick, sharp gasps, my boots kicking up dust and gravel as I moved. A flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, something shifting in the fog. I didn't look. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I kept running. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard voices, low and distorted, carried by the wind. Whispers, and then a shape, a dark figure standing at the edge of my vision. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't let them see you've noticed them. My steps faltered for just a second, and in that moment, something changed. The air shifted. A sound so soft I almost didn't hear it. Breathing. Not mine. I ran faster. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against me, closing in like a living thing. My mind screamed at me to stop, that I was running blindly, deeper into the ruins. But I couldn't stop. Then, a shadow loomed ahead, a shape in the mist. A house. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stumbled to a stop. The door stood slightly open, and it was red. My breath caught in my throat. The man's voice echoed in my mind, cold, warning, final. No one who's entered a red door has ever come back. A creak from inside, the soft rustle of movement. Something was waiting, watching. I took a step back, then another. A whisper curled through the mist. Not words, just a sound. Something shifted behind me. I didn't turn around. I squeezed my eyes shut, forced my legs to move, and ran. This time, I didn't stop. Not when I heard the whispers, not when the air grew colder, not when the red door creaked open behind me. I ran until the fog thinned, until I saw headlights cutting through the mist, until I stumbled back onto the road, gasping, my lungs burning, the bus, the group. Oleg's voice, sharp, calling my name. I barely heard him. My eyes were still fixed on the ruins behind me, the swirling mist, the silent village. Somewhere in the distance, I swore I saw a dark shape standing at the edge of the fog, watching. And then, it was gone. Before I could ask another question, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a small, floating light. At first, it was barely more than a flicker, barely more than a shimmer against the thick fog, but it grew stronger, pulsing, drifting, almost alive. The man's breath hitched. I felt his grip on my sleeve tighten. "Don't follow it," he whispered, barely audible. His face had drained of all color, his already pale skin now ashen under the dim, shifting glow. His fingers trembled. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away from the light. "What is it?" I asked, my voice too quiet, too unsteady. But he didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the floating glow, as if looking away would invite something worse. The air around us seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin like something tangible, something watching. The fog swirled, curling toward the light as if it too were drawn to it. The light moved. Slowly. Deliberately. It wasn't random. It wasn't a trick of the mist or a reflection of something unseen. It was searching. The man exhaled sharply, his breath coming fast and shallow. His grip on my sleeve tightened until his knuckles turned white. "We need to leave," he muttered, barely moving his lips. "Now." I hesitated for only a moment. Then he yanked me forward. We moved quickly, weaving through the skeletal remains of the village. The fog seemed to close in tighter, clinging to us like a living thing. The air smelled of damp earth and rust, of time left to decay. Behind us, the sound began, a faint dragging noise, something moving, following. I didn't dare turn around. The man's pace quickened, his steps nearly silent against the cracked pavement. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, my chest tightening with every second that passed. Another sound, not just dragging, something else, a whisper, soft, unintelligible, like the wind carrying a voice that didn't belong. Then, I saw it. A house, mostly intact, its roof sagging but still holding, its windows cracked but not shattered. It stood out against the ruins, almost untouched by the decay that had swallowed everything else. But that wasn't what stopped me. It was the door. Bright red. The man froze beside me. I felt his body tense, his breath still and sharp. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The dragging sound behind us grew fainter, almost as if whatever had been following had stopped, watching instead. The fog curled around the house, thick and heavy, pressing against the red door like it was waiting for something. A memory surfaced. It's not just the color, it's what's behind it. No one who's entered a red door has ever come back. My pulse pounded in my ears. The whispering grew louder. The man turned to me, his face ashen, his eyes filled with something I had only seen once before, true, unshakable fear. "We can't stop," he whispered. "Don't look at it. Don't go near it." A soft creak echoed through the silent village. The door was opening. I didn't wait to see what was inside. The man yanked me forward and I ran. The whispering became a chorus, rising in intensity. The dragging sound returned, closer this time, more urgent. The fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the ruins. I focused on my feet, on the uneven pavement beneath me, on the sound of the man's breathing beside me. I didn't look back. Not when I felt something shift in the air behind us. Not when the whispers turned into something almost human. Not when the door creaked open wider. We ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed in protest, until the fog thinned and the skeletal remains of the village faded behind us. And then, a light. Not the unnatural floating glow from before. This was warm, flickering, moving. The headlights of the bus. I stumbled toward it, gasping for breath. The others were there, standing by the bus, talking, unaware of what had just happened. Oleg turned, his expression sharp. "Where the hell were you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words stuck. My hands were shaking. My pulse thundered in my ears. The man beside me was gone. I spun around. The fog stretched endlessly behind me, thick and unmoving. The ruins of Yaniv loomed in the distance, their dark windows empty and hollow. There was no sign of him. No footprints in the dirt. No movement in the mist. Just silence. Just the village. Oleg frowned, stepping closer. "Are you all right?" I forced a nod, my throat too tight to speak. Behind him, the bus doors opened with a mechanical hiss. The warm glow of the interior lights spilled out onto the road. I hesitated. For just a second, I turned back toward the village, and in the distance, standing at the very edge of the mist, a dark figure, watching. Then, the fog swallowed it whole. The dragging sound grew louder, a slow, deliberate scrape against the ground, too heavy for footsteps, too rhythmic to be the wind. A whisper curled through the fog, software almost gentle, but wrong, too cold to be human. The man's grip on my arm tightened until I felt his nails digging into my skin. "We have to hide," he breathed. I didn't argue. We slipped into the nearest shelter, a half-collapsed building, its roof caving inward, its walls stripped bare by time and decay. The air inside was thick, damp, suffocating. Dust and mold clung to every surface, but I barely noticed. My heartbeat drowned out everything else. Outside, the whispering grew louder. Not words, not quite. More like fragments, disjointed sounds that scraped against my skull just beyond the edge of comprehension. The man pressed himself against the crumbling wall, his breath shallow. I followed suit, my body rigid, every muscle locked in place. Then, a knock. Software slow, almost polite. A chill ran down my spine. A second knock, louder this time. The man shook his head violently, eyes wide, pleading. His entire body was tense, as if he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. "No matter what you hear," he whispered, voice razor thin. "Don't open it." A third knock, louder, more insistent. Then, a voice, familiar. "Help me, please. I'm lost." I froze. It was one of the women from my tour group. I knew that voice. The soft lilt, the slight tremor in her accent. But something was wrong. It was too flat, too empty. Like someone was speaking through her, like the words weren't entirely her own. My mouth went dry. My mind screamed for logic, for reason. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she had wandered away from the group like I had. But the man beside me, his face twisted in horror. His grip on my arm tightened, fingers digging in like iron. His whisper was sharp, urgent. "It's not her." His eyes bore into mine. "It's never them." The knocking stopped. A silence fell over the world. Not just the absence of sound. This was deeper, heavier, the kind of silence that doesn't come naturally, the kind that watches, the kind that waits. The man didn't move. Neither did I. The door stood closed. The seconds stretched, elongated, turned into something unbearable. Then, a shuffle, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the building. The whispering returned, closer now, curling through the cracks in the walls, slipping through the gaps like smoke. Something brushed against the outside of the door. Not a knock this time, something dragging. The man exhaled shakily, his hands trembling now. I didn't dare breathe. The whispering shifted, turning into something else. A low, distorted hum. A sick imitation of a lullaby. A pause. Then, the handle of the door rattled. My chest tightened. My pulse slammed against my ribs. The man reached into his coat, pulling out something small, metallic. A knife, dull and rusted, but clenched tightly in his fist as if it were his only lifeline. The rattling stopped. Then, ever so slowly, the handle turned. The man lunged forward, slamming his weight against the door just as it cracked open an inch. A sound, low and guttural, rose from the other side, not quite a growl, not quite human. The man braced himself, every muscle straining. His knuckles went white against the wood. "Don't look," he rasped. I clenched my eyes shut. Something pressed against the door, pushing. The air inside the building felt suffocatingly thick, like it had turned to liquid. My ears rang with something high-pitched and sickly sweet, like a note being played just slightly out of tune. The man gritted his teeth, pressing harder. The thing outside exhaled. It wasn't breath. It was colder. Then, silence. A long pause. The weight against the door lifted. A shuffle. A single step away. Another. Then, the dragging sound returned, moving away this time. The whispers faded. The air lightened, just slightly. The man sagged against the door, his body trembling from exertion. His breath was ragged, uneven. Neither of us moved for a long time. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and raw. Then, barely above a whisper, I asked, "What was that?" The man didn't answer at first. When he did, his voice was hoarse, hollow. "Something that wears familiar voices," he said. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. A thought struck me then. Something far worse than the knocking, the whispers, the thing trying to force its way inside. If it wasn't her, then where is she? I didn't ask the question out loud. Somehow, I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, pressing into my skin like something alive. The man hadn't moved from where he stood, his back still pressed against the door, his breath slow and measured. He was listening, waiting, as if the thing outside might return at any moment. Then, finally, he exhaled. "It's gone." I barely heard him. My body ached from staying so still, my nerves raw from the quiet terror that had settled deep in my bones. But even as he spoke the words, his face remained tense. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't at ease. Because the last traces of light were vanishing. A dull, heavy twilight had settled over the ruins of the village, and I realized with a sinking feeling what that meant. "We can't stay here," the man muttered. "It's getting dark. The rules. Don't stay out after dark." I pushed away from the crumbling wall, my legs shaky but ready to move. The man was already stepping out into the open, his movements fast, urgent. We moved quickly, slipping through the village ruins, fog swirling around us like something restless. The air was colder now, thick with damp and the scent of old decay. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I kept close to him, afraid that if I fell behind even a step, the mist would swallow him whole. Then, shapes in the distance, figures. My breath caught in my throat. People. My group. I recognized them instantly, huddled near the bus, their forms barely visible through the fog. Relief surged through me like a wave, sudden and overwhelming. I broke into a run, my breath ragged, my boots skidding slightly against the damp ground. The guide turned, his face registering shock the second he saw me, his eyes widened, his mouth parting. "Where the hell have you been?" His voice cut through the mist, sharp, disbelieving. I staggered to a stop, chest heaving. I got lost, I managed, my voice hoarse. "But I was with him." I turned, gesturing to the man who had led me here. But my hand met empty air. He was gone. My stomach twisted. I spun around, searching the thick fog, scanning the ruins. Nothing. Not a single trace of him. The air felt different now, lighter, almost normal. The fog was thinning, revealing the skeletal remains of Yaniv bathed in soft gray light. The red door stood untouched in the distance, silent, still. No sign of the terror I had lived through. No footprints in the dirt. No lingering whispers in the wind. No trace of the man who had guided me. It was as if the village itself had swallowed him whole. I turned back to the guide, my hands shaking. He was just here, I insisted, my voice weaker now. He saved me, we hid, and… The guide didn't respond at first. He only stared, something strange flickering in his expression, not just confusion, something deeper, something like fear. You've been missing for almost 3 days. The words didn't register at first. I blinked. What? His jaw clenched. We've been searching for you. 3 days. I shook my head violently. Number. That's impossible. I was only gone for… I stopped. I had no answer. I had no idea how long I had been inside that house, how long I had been running through the mist, how long I had been listening to the whispers just beyond the walls. But it hadn't been 3 days. It couldn't have been. I looked at the others. Some of them had the same expression as the guide, stunned, disbelieving. Others avoided my eyes altogether. You don't look like someone who's been out here for 3 days, one of them muttered. No scratches, no frostbite, nothing. You just… She hesitated. You just look… off. A deep, uneasy silence settled between us. I turned toward the village again, my heart pounding for a different reason now. If it had really been 3 days, if I had been missing all this time, then where had I been? Had I ever left the village at all? The guide exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. We need to get out of here, he muttered. Now. I barely heard him, because in the distance, at the very edge of the mist, a figure stood watching, still, silent, almost familiar. I opened my mouth to call out, but then the fog shifted, curling around him like a veil, and he was gone. I followed the group to the bus, my steps slow, my mind tangled in a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Who was he? How had he known the rules? Why had he helped me? And why, above all, had I felt so drawn to this village in the first place? The others avoided my gaze as I climbed onto the bus, settling into my seat with a heaviness that felt almost unnatural. They still weren't sure what to make of me, whether to be relieved, disturbed, or wary. I wasn't sure either. The engine rumbled to life, and the bus lurched forward, rolling down the cracked, overgrown road that led out of Yaniv. The skeletal remains of the village passed by in the fading light. Shattered windows, twisted trees, buildings slowly being swallowed by time. The fear still clung to me, thick as the fog had been. But now, something else lingered beneath it. A feeling I couldn't shake. Something unfinished. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching as Yaniv disappeared behind us, swallowed once again by the mist. My pulse still hadn't returned to normal. My body still felt wrong, like I had stepped out of something I wasn't supposed to survive. Had I really been gone for 3 days? Or had time bent around me, trapping me in some place where minutes stretched into hours, where whispers stole away time like breath in the cold? I shut my eyes. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. The bus jolted over a pothole, and my fingers dug into the armrest. I inhaled sharply, my pulse quickening at the sudden motion. But when I opened my eyes again, something in the pit of my stomach dropped. The window, for just a fraction of a second before the fog swallowed everything whole, I saw him, standing at the village's edge, watching. My breath caught in my throat, my body tensed, my mind screaming at me to react, to do something. But then he was gone. I pressed a shaking hand against the glass, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Had I really seen him? Or had the village left something inside me, something that refused to let go? I slumped back against the seat, swallowing hard, forcing air into my lungs. My hands were still trembling. I tried to tell myself it was over. I was leaving the village behind. I had survived. But the thought didn't bring relief. It brought a single, suffocating question. A question that burned through my mind, looping over and over, impossible to silence. What would have happened if I had opened the red door? No one spoke after the guide's initial outburst. No one pressed me for details. No one asked where I had been. Maybe they could see the exhaustion in my eyes, the way my hands trembled slightly against my lap. Or maybe, just maybe, they sensed that something about me wasn't quite right anymore. I sat by the window, fingers pressed against the cold glass, watching as the skeletal remains of Yaniv faded into the mist. The ruins blurred, dissolving into the fog as though they had never existed at all. But even as we left it behind, the weight of the village stayed with me. The man, if he had even been real, had saved me. But from what? The knocking, the whispers, the thing wearing the voice of my missing tour member. I knew those weren't hallucinations. I had felt them. I had heard them. The rules. Don't stay out after dark. Don't let them see you've noticed them. Never follow the lights. Never enter a house with a red door. Had the man been bound by those same rules? Had he followed them for so long that he had become something else? A remnant of the village, trapped in its silent grip? Or had he once been like me? Someone who had wandered too far, lured in by something they didn't understand. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. If I had opened the red door, would I have disappeared too? Would I have become one of them? I glanced down at my hands. The dirt was caked beneath my fingernails, my clothes smeared with grime from stumbling through the abandoned streets. My boots were scuffed, my skin cold to the touch. But something gnawed at the edge of my thoughts. If I had truly been missing for 3 days, why wasn't I hungry? Why wasn't I weaker? My stomach didn't ache with emptiness. My limbs weren't sore from exhaustion. The human body needed water, food, rest. 3 days without any of those things should have left me in agony. But I felt the same, as if no time had passed at all. I clenched my fists, my breath shaky. It didn't make sense. Nothing did. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the window. The hum of the bus engine vibrated through my skull, lulling me into something close to sleep. But just as I started to drift, something in the back of my mind stirred. A voice, a whisper. It's not just the color. It's what's behind it. My eyes snapped open. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and endless, the last remnants of the fog clinging to the trees that lined the cracked pavement. The sky had darkened to a dull slate gray, the air thick with the promise of rain. But something felt wrong. I turned my head slightly, glancing at the reflection in the window, and my blood turned to ice. For the briefest of moments, in the warped glass, I saw him, the man who had saved me, sitting in the seat behind me. Still, silent, watching. I twisted in my seat, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The row was empty. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to turn back toward the window. It was just a trick of the light, a lingering shadow in my mind, a memory that refused to fade. But deep down, I knew the truth. The village had let me go, but it hadn't let me leave. By the time we arrived back in Kiev, my mind felt detached from my body. My legs carried me forward, my hands fumbled for my hotel key, and at some point, I must have checked in. But I barely remembered any of it. It was as if a part of me had never left Yaniv. The city lights were too bright, the streets too loud. People moved past me in a blur of voices and footsteps, unaware that I had walked somewhere I shouldn't have, that I had stepped too close to something the world had long since abandoned. My hotel room was small, unremarkable. 4 plain walls, a bed with stiff sheets, a single lamp that buzzed faintly when I turned it on. It was normal, safe, and yet the feeling didn't go away. That wrongness, that sensation of something unseen just beyond the edge of my vision, it clung to me like fog. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind unraveling the same questions over and over. Had I really been gone for 3 days? If so, how had I survived? No food, no water, no shelter from the freezing cold of the zone. I felt fine, physically, at least. No exhaustion, no hunger, no sign that my body had been deprived of anything essential. But my mind was still trapped there, in the whispers, in the dark, in the rules I had been forced to follow. And then, there was him, the man. Who had he been? A lost traveler, like me? Someone who had strayed too far and learned too late that the village does not let go? A ghost, caught between this world and whatever lay beyond the red door, or something else entirely? Something not human? A chill crept up my spine, the memory of his voice echoing in my head. It's never them. I shuddered, pulling the thin blanket tighter around myself. But the warmth did nothing to shake the feeling that something unseen still pressed against my skin, still watched. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but my mind refused. It kept pulling me back, making me relive every moment, every rule, every mistake I had almost made. I had obeyed. I had listened. But what if I hadn't? What if I had followed the light? What if I had looked when I wasn't supposed to? What if I had opened the red door? My breathing grew uneven. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. A whisper curled through the edges of my thoughts. Don't let them see you've noticed them. I shot up in bed, my skin damp with sweat. My pulse roared in my ears. The room was dark, too dark. The single lamp that had been buzzing earlier, off. I didn't remember turning it off. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy, thick, watched. I turned my head, slowly, hesitantly, and for a single, breathless moment, I saw him. A shadow. A shape standing just at the edge of the room, where the darkness was deepest. Still. Silent. Watching. I blinked. And he was gone. I forced myself to breathe, pressing a hand against my chest to steady the erratic thumping of my heart. It wasn't real. It was a trick of the mind, a leftover piece of the nightmare I had lived through in Yaniv. I was safe. But as I lay back down, pulling the blanket over my shoulders, one thought stayed with me, creeping into the depths of my mind, refusing to let go. What if I hadn't left at all? What if a part of me was still there? What if it was waiting for me to come back? Morning arrived like a dull haze, pressing against my skull with the weight of exhaustion. I barely remembered falling asleep. Maybe I hadn't. Maybe my mind had just shut down, unable to process the things it had seen. But even as the sun climbed higher, filtering weakly through the hotel curtains, the feeling remained. The feeling that something had followed me, that it was still watching. I forced myself out of bed, ignoring the stiffness in my limbs, and reached for my phone. I needed proof. I needed something, anything, to anchor me back to reality. I opened my gallery. The images flashed by one, photos I had taken before I got separated from the group. The ruined village, the skeletal buildings swallowed by the fog, the rusting remains of Yaniv's train station. Each picture was eerily still, frozen moments of a place long abandoned. Then, I stopped. My chest tightened. My hands trembled as I tapped the screen, enlarging the photo. It was an old, decaying building, just like the others. A house, its walls barely holding together, its windows shattered. But unlike the rest, its door was red, and standing just outside of it, half hidden by the fog, was him, the man who had saved me. But the way he stood, the way the fog curled around his body, it wasn't natural. His face was blurred, warped, as if the camera had struggled to capture him. His body looked stretched in places, like an old photograph that had begun to decay over time. And the worst part, the part that made my breath catch in my throat, that sent a sickening wave of realization crashing over me. The red door was open. I dropped the phone. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud, but I barely noticed. My entire body had gone cold. The red door, the one I had been warned about. No one who's entered a red door has ever come back. And yet, he had been standing right in front of it, the man who had led me out of the village, the man who had known the rules. Had he been warning me? Or had he come from the other side? I hesitated before reaching down, my fingers stiff as I picked up the phone again. I forced myself to stare at the image, my eyes darting between the fog, the figure, the open door. Had I taken this photo before I got lost? Or after? I didn't remember taking it. I didn't remember standing in front of that house, lifting my phone, pressing the shutter. Had I been there? Had I stood before the red door and simply forgotten? My stomach twisted. I checked the timestamp on the photo. It was impossible. The image had been taken 2 days after I had disappeared. I clenched my jaw, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. I scrolled frantically, looking for anything, any clue, any missing time, any sign that I hadn't imagined it all. Then I found it. A video. The thumbnail was shrouded in gray mist, the same as every other image. My fingers hovered over it, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't remember taking a video. With a deep breath, I tapped play. The screen flickered. The camera was shaky, the sound of my own uneven breathing filling the speakers. The footage was dark, blurred, the outlines of the abandoned buildings barely visible through the fog. Then, a sound, faint, a whisper. I turned the volume up, straining to hear it. At first it was just the wind. Then, a knock, software slow, almost polite. A second knock, louder. The camera jolted slightly like I had turned too fast. The fog thickened, the air hummed. Then a voice, familiar. "Help me, please, I'm lost." The video cut off. I dropped the phone again, bile rising in my throat. It was her, the woman from my group. The voice that had come from behind the door, the one I had been warned wasn't really her. Had I been filming when it happened? Had I almost opened the door? I ran a hand through my damp hair, my mind racing. The red door had been open. Had I opened it? Or had something been waiting for me to come back? A sharp knock at the hotel door made me flinch violently. I stared at the door, heart in my throat. My fingers twitched, my breath shallow. Another knock. I didn't move. "No matter what you hear, don't open it." I squeezed my eyes shut. "It's nothing. It's just room service. Just the hotel staff. Just..." A third knock. Slow, measured, almost polite. I forced myself to breathe, my pulse hammering. And then, a voice, software familiar. "Hey, are you awake? It's me." My breath hitched. I knew that voice, the guide. Oleg, the man who had been searching for me, the one who had found me. But something was wrong. His voice sounded too flat, too empty, like someone speaking through him, shaping the words but not understanding them. I stayed completely still, gripping the edge of the bed so hard my knuckles turned white. Another knock. Then, silence. It stretched out endlessly. I listened, waited. The air felt thick. The room felt smaller. But the door never opened. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly reached for my phone again. My hands were still shaking as I checked the screen. The video was gone, not deleted, not in my files, just gone. Like it had never existed, like something didn't want me to remember. The red door, the whispering voices, the missing time, the man who had saved me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. But no matter how hard I tried, one thought refused to leave my mind. The red door was open, and I would never know what had been waiting on the other side. I left Ukraine 2 days later. I didn't tell anyone about Yaniv, not the tour company, not the police, not my friends, because how could I? Who would believe me? That I had vanished for 3 days without hunger, without thirst, without any memory of where I had been? That I had been warned by a man who may not have even existed? That something, not someone, had knocked on a door, wearing the voice of a lost traveler? Some things aren't meant to be spoken aloud. So I swallowed it all down, the whispers, the red door, the lingering question of what had really happened to me in that village, and I tried to move on. But even after I got home, it followed me. It wasn't obvious at first, just a feeling, subtle, nagging, like a shadow that should have disappeared but hadn't. The first night back, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I was in the mist again, hearing the echo of my own voice whispering the same question over and over. What would have happened if I had opened the door? The second night, the whispers started. Not real words, just sounds, soft, just at the edge of hearing. The kind of sound that makes you doubt yourself, makes you wonder if your mind is simply filling in the silence with something worse. By the third night, the knocking began. The first time I jolted awake, heart pounding, as a soft knock echoed through my bedroom. Once, twice, 3 times, slow, measured, almost polite. I lay frozen in my bed, my breath shallow. For a long moment nothing moved. The world held its breath. Then the knocking came again. I knew better now. I did not answer. I did not move. I did not breathe. I counted the seconds, waiting for it to go away. Eventually it did. The next morning, I told myself it had been my imagination, that my nerves were frayed, that my mind was still tangled in the nightmares of Yaniv, that I was just hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking didn't stop. It didn't happen every night. It was unpredictable, waiting for when I had let my guard down. Sometimes it was at midnight, sometimes just before dawn. Once, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. An unknown number, no message, no voicemail, just silence. But I didn't need to hear anything. I already knew. Something had followed me from Yaniv. Something knew that I had seen the red door. One night, I woke up gasping, my body drenched in cold sweat. I didn't know why at first. There had been no knocking, no whispering, no flicker of movement in the shadows, just a terrible, suffocating feeling, a weight pressing down on my chest. The silence was too perfect. That's when I heard it. A voice, software right next to my ear. "You saw the door." I bolted upright, my entire body trembling. My skin felt ice cold, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. But there was nothing there, just my darkened bedroom, the distant hum of the city outside my window. Normal, safe, wrong. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I packed a bag. By sunset, I had moved to a new apartment across the city. I changed my number, deleted all my photos from the trip, tried to erase every trace of what had happened. I told myself it was over, that I had left whatever it was behind, that it couldn't follow me here. But some things do not care about distance. Some things do not need doors to enter. Some things find you wherever you go. Weeks passed, then months. For a while, the knocking stopped, the whispers faded. I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. Maybe the man in the mist had protected me after all. Maybe I had left Yaniv for good. But then, one night as I lay in bed, the world silent around me, a knock, software measured, polite. My body locked in place, every muscle tensing, once, twice, 3 times. My mouth went dry, my pulse thundered in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut. Number not again. I would not answer. I knew better. I curled under the covers, forcing my breathing to slow, praying that whatever was on the other side would leave me alone. And for a long time, it was silent. Then, from just beyond the door, a whisper. "You can't ignore it forever." My throat tightened. The air in the room seemed to shrink, pressing against me, watching. The knock came again. And I knew. One day, I might not be strong enough to ignore it. One day, I might let curiosity win. I might listen. I might open the door. And if I do, I won't come back.